Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
You are not the victim of complexity. You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. Because very often when people find themselves in deep complexity, they feel like they have no agency. And in companies, for example, people would say, oh, this is a really big ship to turn. But what turns a big ship is a small rudder, and so I think to understand that we have agency, we are in these systems, we can navigate complexity. We do it all the time. If you have teenagers, you know how to navigate complexity. We just need to change the way that we think about these things, and we need to get out of the zoo in the mind and understand that we're in a jungle, and we know how to be there as humans. So I guess demystify the complexity, get fit for it, and see it as see the beauty in it.
Who is Sonja? Blignaut or Blignaut? How do you pronounce your last name?
In South Africa, I pronounce it Blignaut. But when I go to Europe, I revert to the French, which is easier, I think. Blignaut, yeah.
Blignaut, yeah. So what's been your journey?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Where to start? I think I'll start with what I studied. So I come from the natural sciences. I'm a meteorologist by training. And many people ask me, how did I get from working with the weather to doing what I'm doing now? And typically I ask them, so do you work with people? And when they say yes, then I ask, so what do you think is most unpredictable, the weather or people? And then the penny kind of drops. So I worked as a meteorologist for a while. I did some software development, computer programming. And then in the early 2000s, I met Professor Dave Snowden. We were both employed in IBM at the time. Mm-hmm. And he formally introduced me to the science or the theory of complexity. And there was just an immediate resonance. I was a very unhappy consultant. I found that typical consulting paradigm of selling recipes, of disregarding context. I found it a very exploitative industry. I didn't enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And I just immediately loved everything about complexity. And I managed to get onto some of the first projects in South Africa using some of the Cynefin methods. Mm-hmm. And I just managed to stick with it, so I've been fortunate to be, kind of practically applying complexity ideas now for almost two decades. Yeah. At the moment, I'm in a new partnership, and we're exploring ideas around what it means to be complexity fit. Mm-hmm. And I guess part of what can't really call it a mission, but I think what I'm really passionate about is how do you democratize complexity thinking? Because, for so long, it's kind of been in the realm of the theorists and, people, using the big words and or only people on certain levels in organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think where we are in the world today, everybody needs a basic understanding of it, even if you're a housewife, stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. Student. So yeah, that's more or less. And then I live in South Africa, if my accent hasn't given it away already. And husband and three dogs and a bit of a coffee snob. I even brought some with me.
I saw that. And another thing that caught my attention is in a lot of your writing, you use poetry. That's something that maybe we can bring in at some point in the conversation, but I saw that, which is nice. And I started reading. I just recently found out of your work, so I'm surprised like that. I didn't see your work earlier. And I really like it. And I like some of the metaphors and also the poetry that you put in your writing is nice. I like it. Maybe just for those that may not be, they might be familiar with complicated and complex concepts, but could you maybe talk about what are complex adaptive systems, and how may they be, how are complex adaptive systems maybe different than just when we talk about complexity in general?
So I normally start by just explaining, what complexity is, because what I find is in in our normal everyday language, we tend to use these words in different ways than what we talk about when we kind of use them formally. And I like to make a distinction between complicatedness and complexity, because that's typically where we tend to confuse things. So sometimes we talk about in our normal language as something is complex when it is almost like a higher order of difficulty. So the more moving parts, the more difficult something is, we tend to describe it as complex. But in our language, if I go to the root word complicated, that word plik, it means folded. So if you think of an intricate, almost like an origami fold, I can still unfold it. I can fully understand it. I can replicate it. I can become an expert in it. It's something that is fully knowable. And I think this is also how I would define a complicated system. It's a system that's fully knowable. It's bounded in such a way that I can almost see, it's almost like my laptop. It's a complicated system. I can see where it is. It's bounded. It's got, I don't have to think about where does it start or where does it end.
And also it doesn't have those emerging properties, like your laptop pieces are not going to rearrange. That's something, right, that's also specific to the order. Yeah.
And one of the my favorite complexity theorists, someone called Paul Sillier, he was also in South African. He died way too young a few years ago. He had this tagline where he said, "Nobody wants to fly in a plane with emergent properties." I think that is definitely true. Yeah, so I mean that's one of the things, and complex. So that word plex means braided or tangled. So we talk about entangled systems, or they are messy by nature. Yeah. And so one of the key distinctions, as you said, they have emergent properties. So the whole is not equal or similar to the sum of its parts. So there are properties in a complex system. If you think of a family, there's almost like an emergent identity, an emergent vibe, if you think of a city, that you can't explain by looking at the parts. And also they are open systems. So you don't really know where the boundaries are. So if you take a family, if there's a problem in the family and I want to intervene, let's say I'm a therapist, where do I draw the line? Is it only the mother, father, and child? Is it, do the friends play a role? Does society play a role? Where does this system start and end? So it's a very different kind of a system, and also where the adaptive aspect comes in. These systems, they self-organize, they are emergent, and they are able to respond to the agents inside of them, but also their external context. So it's dynamic, it's continuously in flux. Yeah. So it's very different from a complicated or an ordered system.
What role does interdependence play in a complexity of a system? So relationships and interdependence on other parts or those agents in the system.
So typically, what the theory says is, so complexity arises from the interconnectedness between things. Mm-hmm. So the complexity sits in the interconnectivity, it sits in the connections, in the relationships, not necessarily in the parts. Mm-hmm. So the more interconnected, the more connections there are, the more complex. And if there's interdependency as well, it just immediately increases the levels of complexity, of uncertainty, because the other thing with a complex system is that, whereas in a complicated or an ordered system, things connect in linear ways. Mm-hmm. They also connect in predictable ways, so as we explored earlier, if when a gear lever and the gear connect, they don't change each other. In a complex system, when things connect, they change each other. It's a rich connection. So the more interdependencies, the more connections, the more complex.
So that makes me think about, organizations and how do those, how much people or to what extent people increase complexity in organizations by creating additional dependencies and creating that interdependence by structuring by silos. And what is your thought on that, like self-inflicted, not necessarily self-inflicted, I guess that's a wrong term, but like just how much do we, make things more complex as humans, where maybe we could minimize that interdependence? Just is there anything there that maybe you want to comment on?
I think there are two things. One is, I think if you look at in a typical organization, our hierarchies and things become very deep. Yeah. They've got multiple levels. I'm not anti-hierarchy. I believe hierarchies emerge naturally in human systems.
Yeah.
But what happens is we make them very deep, and then what we tend to do is then we also turn them into a matrix. And where that then becomes problematic is when you've got now multiple reporting lines. You've got multiple competing priorities, so all of these things increase the complexity. But I think what I've seen in terms of, let's call it self-inflicted complexity, is the moment somebody tells me we are adopting a customer-centric strategy, then I know immediately that they are increasing their complexity. Because now, if you think about it, now you have to collaborate across the silos. There's no longer one clear owner of value chain. Suddenly somebody needs to almost, you're not the owner of it, so now you need to influence how things flow across the value chain. So it just immediately increases the complexity. But I think the other thing that I wanted to say is very often, I think we respond to the uncertainty and the unpredictability that is in the complexity by overcomplicating things. So we overcomplicate our processes, we overcomplicate, many, and those things can be simplified. You can't simplify complexity. Yes, complexity is, but you can simplify the complicatedness that you create for yourself. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, but what's going through my head is that people that are designing or increasing that complexity, from their perspective, they think they're simplifying things. A lot of times, like, oh yeah, we're just adding another process, or we're adding this to simplify things. But really, the awareness of the bigger system and what's going on is lacking. And I think it's almost like we don't even know that we're increasing complexity. We actually think we're decreasing complexity, and we're dealing, and maybe it's that desire to deal with uncertainty and desire to just avoid uncertainty, but in that process we create more complexity.
And the thing is, in complexity, we also have these wonderful things. The Australians call them boomerang effects, but I just talk about unintended consequences. And I think we tend to, it's a bit of a sickness, really. If I really have to think, we tend to think in terms of things and objects that fit into particular categories. We have I think Alicia Guerrero calls them thingness. And, we don't think in terms of how things are connected, what the relationships are, what needs to flow, what is already flowing. We don't think in terms of flows and connections. We think in terms of things. Yeah. So when you think of how we typically go about an organizational restructuring, it's almost like we see these different areas of the business as things, as objects we can move around. And, I think this very often creates, unintended consequences. It increases the complexity because we don't think about how changing something in this part of the system can potentially have ripple effects through the whole system.
Yeah, and what that is also make me think of is the boundaries, right? Like a lot of times we think, and if you look at specific frameworks in the industry that are being sold, and you mentioned recipes earlier, they're almost being sold as recipes, and we think like we need to we talk about self-organization, but really, and what I've heard you talk about is in the for complex adaptive systems or in complexity, we're trying to have these boundaries. Could you maybe talk about in the context of organizational structure and governance and those type of systems, how do we create boundaries and allow for emergence and self-organization rather than try to specifically design and say, okay, this is how we're going to, self-organize. Here's A, B, C, D for self-organization.
Yeah. So self-organization, it's already happening. Any complex system is already self-organizing. It's just usually it's not self-organizing in the way that we want it to. That's the interesting thing here. But if there are no boundaries, so just going back to the theory a little bit, and I'm not sure I'm sure you are a little bit familiar with the Cynefin framework, but if you just contrast, so we've spoken about complicated systems, complex systems, there's another kind of system, which is a chaotic system, and that is a system where it's not constrained at all. There aren't any boundaries. And self-organization can't happen if there aren't any boundaries. We need constraints, we need those boundaries. So I think in an organizational system, there's a bit of it's about a balance between, I guess, the governing constraints, the constraints that in a way are pretty rigid and that determines what can happen, the rules and the policies and the procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And what we call enabling constraints, which, these are constraints that simply by being there, they make other things possible. They allow us to self-organize. So if you think of I guess one of the best ways to describe this is if you think of a sport, like a team sport, like rugby or soccer. We've got the constraints that govern the game. So where does the field begin and end? What are the rules of engagement? But then we have enabling constraints. It's how the team works together, what their emerging game plan is. Without those constraints, we can't have a game. Mm-hmm. And so I think in the context of organizations, I think sometimes our constraints are too rigid, or they create unintended consequences. So very often constraints in an organization either take the form of the structure, so the hierarchy, or how teams are how business units relate to each other, etc. Mm-hmm. Or they take the form of what we choose to measure. So how do we measure performance? How do we set targets? All of these things. And if we choose to measure the wrong things, very often we undermine the self-organization, the things that we actually want to achieve. Or if we make the structures too rigid. On the other hand, if we make it too loose, if you just tell a team, oh, you must self-organize, but we don't give them any kind of a sense of direction, we don't tell them where the boundaries are. And it's a bit like children. Yeah. If children don't know where the boundaries are, they'll keep testing them, or they will feel unsafe and they won't explore. Mm-hmm. So boundaries in a human system they're important things.
Yeah, and so something that you just said, I think I listened either in one of the podcasts or that you were on, or in one of the things that you wrote. But you talked about like the things that are unknown, or things that we can't go, and things where there was like a pizza reference. Could you maybe talk about that? Because I thought that was interesting when it comes to those boundaries.
Yeah, so I've been kind of playing around with a framework that I've this is my own way of trying to make sense of how constraints work and where these boundaries, and I found that, some of the theorists, I just found it really difficult to understand. So this was my way of trying to figure this out. And essentially, so some of my clients call it Sonja's pizza slice. It's if you imagine the world of order or complicatedness to be a linear A to B world, it's we are here, we want to get there. How do we get there? How do we close the gap? It's quite a linear way of thinking. Very often it's problem solution mindset, but it's a very linear world, and A and B are both known. In complexity, A is not stable, so A is moving. We're not in the same place all the time, and B is unknown. So the first constraint is to choose a sense of direction, not necessarily a fixed goal. So in complicatedness, B can be a fixed point, a goal. In complexity, we open it up. This is where the pie slice comes from, and it says we set direction. And direction is a boundary or a constraint, because if I choose I'm going north, it means I'm not going south. So I'm excluding something, so it is a form of constraint. So once I've set the direction, this is where the safety guardrails, some people call them, but the boundaries, it creates, Dave Snowden talks about a safe to fail environment. Sometimes I refer to safe to try, but it creates an explore space. And there are two kinds of constraints here. One I call limits. So these are constraints that we can't do anything about. We just need to work within them. And these can be things like the laws governing business in a certain country. It could be things like budget. It could be, so these are things that we have no control over. We just have to work within them. It could even be things like what we are able to do, like what resources do we have available and what skills, so it all depends on the context. That's the one kind of boundary. The second kind of boundary is different because we choose that boundary. And it's almost to say, if this is where we can't go, then this one is where do we not want to go? So we impose this boundary ourselves, and this could be things like values. It could be things like, for example, I worked with one client who they were a fertilizer company, and they had to decide, do they want to become a chemical company? Did they want to become an agricultural company? What did they want to be? And they had to set a boundary because they couldn't be everything. So those are the two. And when you have a sense of direction and you have these guardrails, what it means is that you can distribute decision-making. Because as long as people are heading in the same direction within those boundaries, you can allow greater freedom. So that's the essence of, I call it the ways finder, but it keeps evolving.
But I think there's an underlying pattern there or theme, and maybe we can tie it back to just the last maybe 10 years and maybe even 20 years of this Agile movement, where it's been very kind of prescriptive, right? If we look at, frameworks, if we look at, even scaling frameworks, it doesn't really align with what you just said about those boundaries and creating. It's like that piece of pie is very specific of what you do. What do you think? You've been consulting and working with organizations, for 2 decades. What are the things that are emerging currently when it comes to framework? Is it, where companies that are dealing better with complexity are embracing what you just described and they're creating almost their own ways and navigating in that space? Or is it more that, they're in those frameworks, but they're modifying frameworks? What do you think is where is, the not just the Agile community, it's bigger than that, like just organizational, maybe that organizational fitness, or where is that heading now? What are organizations doing, and the ones that are succeeding when it comes to dealing with complexity?
I think there are multiple things happening at the same time. It's almost as if there's a bit of a casting around. And there are different responses. I think some of the large corporates that I work with, it's almost like they They understand that there's a need for something different, but they just almost cannot bring themselves to take the steps that they need to get there. So one of the other things I wrote, it was a bit of a play on words, but I said we have organizational OCD.
Yeah.
And it's obsessive control or certainty disorder. It's and what I'm seeing, even in agile spaces, is almost like a doubling down on things like safe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going back to something that feels familiar and that gives us a sense of control.
Mm-hmm.
In others, what I'm seeing is it's not a complete, like a free for all and trying to find completely different ways of doing things. There's almost a decomposition and recombination of different agile methods. So they'll take a piece of Kanban and a piece of Scrum and a piece of, and they'll almost find their own way, which I think is a healthier way of doing it.
So almost like looking at the patterns and trying to come up with your own framework based on some of these patterns and approaches that fit the context rather than the other way around where you.
Yes, it's like it's almost an emergent form of agility. I have a friend who works in a large bank in Brazil, and they're starting to talk about entangled agility. I find that quite interesting. It's almost like what exists in the spaces in between, in those liminal spaces. But I think because actually when I started thinking about this framework, it was, my husband is an agile coach. And so I've been observing the agile community for quite a while. And I got quite frustrated by how formulaic it is. And also how many failed agile implementations there are around. Because here in South Africa, I'm not sure what it's like in the rest of the world, many of our large corporates have actually gone back to having project offices. They've abandoned, they keep some of the language, but they've essentially gone back to waterfall. And I think part of this is because we get so stuck in the recipe. So a consultant comes in and they sell you the new thing is Scrum. Then Scrum doesn't work. Then it's like, okay, let's do Scrum harder. And let's introduce safe, which I know there's lots of views around. But then when that doesn't work, okay, maybe you should try Kanban. It's almost like we cycle through the different recipes instead of just figuring out what is the context here, what might work here, and how can we experiment and find our own, fit for context way of being agile. I don't see a lot of that happening.
Do you think that's a people issue? Do you think that's a system issue, in a sense that the agents within the system, even if they're given the autonomy and that piece of the pie that gives them that autonomy, are they competent? So, to actually apply these. So where does the people factor and the competence come into a play here, or does it come into play at all?
I don't know. Well, I think it's probably a little bit of all of those things. But I think more than a people problem, I think it's in many organizations, even though, we go out there and we say, you need to fail fast and fail, quick, all of those things. But failure is not really tolerated. So experimentation is not, we say that we want people to experiment, but when it comes to actually experimenting, we don't really, it doesn't fit with the performance targets we set and, all of these things. So in many companies, I think people choose the safe route. Not safe as in the methodology, but safe as in, it's that old adage that says nobody's been fired for hiring McKinsey. So if I can show I followed best practice and I implemented this the way that I was taught and the way that the books say we should do, and it fails, then it's not my fault. So I think there's an aspect of that. I also think that I think that just the way that agile coaches and scrum masters are trained, I think there's a problem there as well. I don't know if the whole certification route, people becoming, because, you know, if I'm certified as a Scrum Master, then I'm going to push Scrum onto wherever I'm working.
Yeah.
You know, there's a, and so I don't know if it's necessarily only the competence of the people. I think it's a systemic thing. You know, I think there's a reason why executives buy into SAFe, you know, because it looks familiar. It looks,
Has
you know,
the
it gives,
layers, has everything, yeah, that they
it has the hierarchy, it has the,
Yeah.
you know, it gives them a sense of security.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I wrote early on was, it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And I think the call of the jungle might be there, but the zoo is just very safe.
Yeah.
And it's very comfortable, and you don't get penalized necessarily when you know, so there's I think it's a combination of factors.
Yeah, so that brings me to the question of like you describe it as a complexity fitness, which in my opinion would be that fitness for the jungle, not for the zoo. So what is complexity fitness, and maybe could you talk about that a little bit from your perspective?
So I'll give you a bit of an analogy. You know, so we went looking to see who are people that tend to not only survive in complexity, and by that I mean, you know, almost like continuous flux and instability and uncertainty. They thrive there. They don't only survive there. And there are many of them, but one group that I got quite fascinated by is surfers. You know, they go out into the open ocean, and it's just they do it for fun. And when you look at how they're able to do it, a part of it, many of them do yoga and Pilates to strengthen their inner core. So if you have a strong, stable inner core, you're able to flex and be in uncertainty. You know, so that's the metaphor we're using. And the word for this that we've come up with is dynamic response ability. You know, and in an ordered system, you know, one of the words that I think has become a problem is responsibility. You know, it's almost become a bit of a stick in many organizations. It's linked to things like compliance and who do I blame when things go wrong? And, you know, it's just responsibility has become a bit of a, but when you look at the initial meaning of it, it's the ability to respond. Yeah. And for me, that is almost the essence of being complexity fit is, do I have dynamic response ability? So I am present. I'm in the moment. I'm able to see what kind of a system am I in. I have situational awareness, and I have the ability to adapt my response based on the kind of systemic context I'm in. So we came up with it's an acronym, but it's more than an acronym. I'll explain it now. So we talk about being cool in complexity. Mm-hmm. And cool it essentially is an acronym for 4 meta skills, which is courage, openness, being observant, and lightness, which has got to do with play and imagination, and, you know, just being able to see the beauty in complexity, which is where the poetry comes from. Mm. And we were very interested when an academic friend of ours sent us an article that talks about the origin of the word cool, which is actually from Central and Western Africa, where it means it's a leadership quality of the ability to remain calm under pressure. You know, so and also there's something where they say the cooler you are, the more connected you are to the wisdom of the ancestors. So it's a much deeper.
So it's almost awareness, like, you know, at least that's what's making me think about, like, you know, the way that you're describing it, somebody that's very aware, like aware of a lot of things, not just self-aware. So,
and able to manage your own responses. I think that's the other thing, to be able to regulate, because this is one of the things that I think gets in our way, is when we find ourselves dumped into uncertainty and volatility and in that messiness of complexity. Sometimes we respond with anxiety, and then we have a knee-jerk response, or we just go back to how we've always done things. And so it's almost the ability to to respond and not just react.
Mhm. That is very, very interesting. Could you maybe talk about the courage, openness, being observant, and lightness a little bit more? Because I'm interested, because that's kind of part of that. Could you maybe like give examples of how that fits into or complexity fitness?
So where that initially came from, so we've been, I'm partnering with this with a friend of mine called Casper Olofsson, who does a lot of work in mindfulness. And we looked at, if we look at our clients who seem to do better in complexity and in uncertainty, and also when we find ourselves in those spaces, what are the meta skills? What are the things that we're drawing on? And these four kept coming up. So courage, we very often associate courage with acts of bravery. But in complexity, sometimes it can take a lot of courage for a leader, for example, to admit that they don't know. If you think of how we're educated and the stories we tell ourselves about what makes a good leader, there are narratives there, leaders know what to do. Leaders have the answers. They're decisive. They're, all of these things. And when we are in uncharted territory, sometimes we can't know. And so it can take a lot of courage to say, I don't know, but let's find out together, or to say yes to going into the unknown, or to say no and to set a boundary. I think in our current environment with hybrid work, what we're seeing is a dissolving of boundaries, and people, we'd like to say, we're not working from home, we're living at work. And so to be able to set a boundary sometimes can take a lot of courage, so it's almost to go in the opposite direction, to experiment. So that's courage. Openness is about being open to learning and unlearning, to be curious versus to just immediately jump to judgment. I've been very interested, for example, just looking at the dynamics now around the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And how all the different responses, and we aren't really curious. We just immediately judge when somebody has a different response or a different way of thinking. So how can we be open to be curious? How can we be open just to experiencing new things? So it's openness to diversity, openness to new things, openness to unlearning. Observing is an interesting one. It has two sides. One is observing the external environment, so zooming in and out of the context. Heifetz talks about get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. So can I zoom into the detail and out to see the patterns, out to see the whole? So that's one thing. It's, I think it's linked to things like the OODA loop and all of these. Can I observe what's going on? But then there's another aspect to it, is can I zoom internal? Can I go inside and then come back out again? Can I observe my own inner responses to things? Can I be in the moment? This is where mindfulness starts coming into it, because otherwise you get that knee-jerk response that we already spoke about. And then lightness is a really interesting one. It's complexity can start to feel extremely heavy, because some of the complex problems that we're dealing with as humanity almost, can actually start to feel really, really heavy. And we need to be able to show up with playfulness. I came across a quote the other day that says, play is training for the unexpected. We talk about play, but we don't really play. We say we play with the numbers, but we don't really play. We just say it. So how do we bring our imagination, our collective imagination, back to work, or bring it to bear on these problems? How do we play? When was the last time we laughed together as a team? Like, what role does humor play? And then poetry, you've already mentioned this. Complex systems are beautiful. All living systems are complex, and there's beauty there, but we tend to miss it. And I came across a quote, I think it was David White, but I think he was quoting somebody else, but he said, the only language expansive enough for what we're facing now is the language of poetry. So yeah, so that's cool. And they're very entangled. I need to present them in sequence, otherwise it doesn't make the cool acronym, but they are very deeply interdependent.
less linear. That is very interesting, and like, you know, it is making me think about, and I don't know how familiar, and we don't have to go down that path, but like from human development, like adult development stages. And I spoke with Dave Snowden. He kind of crapped all over those type of frameworks. But what is how much or how much weight would you put when it comes, because like that awareness or ability to observe as a leader? And maybe the question is really like, you know, what are some of the characteristics? How do you lead in a complex environment? And what are some of the characteristics that you look for in leader? And you know, when it comes to complexity, and is there anything they would maybe point to when it comes to levels of self-awareness, how self-aware individual is, how they deal with ego and what their motivations are, and how that points to their ability or fitness to deal in complexity?
This is a complex question in itself.
It is, and that's why I'm saying, like, we don't have to. Maybe we can, you know, simplify it, or to take it just, you know, what does it take to lead in complexity? But if you want, you can comment on.
I think it's
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the literature nowadays are questioning even what is leadership in a complex system, because I think we still have many of these archetypes of the heroic individual leader. You know, and in complexity, I'm not sure, you know, I think this is much more about emergent and collective leadership, and even just the relationship between followership and leadership. So there's you know, and I'm not a leadership expert. I think it's always a difficult question for me because, you know, I think everybody has the ability to be in complexity. I don't think certain personalities, you know, if you think about it, we are in complexity all the time. If you're a parent, you're managing complexity. If you're in traffic, you're in complexity. So I'm not quite as negative about adult development stages as Dave is. I know he's very against it. I see it as very contextual, you know, so I don't see it as something that is linear and something where, you know, if somebody is in the self-transforming stage, for example, that they are lesser, or there's something, you know, wrong with them if they are on one of the other levels.
I don't think it's more like, it's not necessarily wrong. It's like fitness, right? So like if I'm, you know, playing professional soccer, there's a certain level of fitness that I need to be, versus if I'm just playing with my buddies, you know, just in the pickup game. But it's more like, and I don't know, I'm not an expert either, but it seems, at least to me, there is some connection between, you know, the type of lead, like how much am I driven by my own desires and ego, versus how much do I think about the overall system? Because if I only think about the subsystem as a leader, I'm probably going to sub-optimize. So if you look at organizations where you have leaders that are only looking for their little fiefdom, and how do I get my bonus, and that's, you know, what I need to get my kids, you know, colleges paid. There's a difference in another person who's saying, well, yes, you know, I want to look at my fiefdom, but, and yes, I have kids in college, but also my morals or ethics, whatever you want to call them, call up on something bigger for me to look at the more systemic view and do what's right, not just for my family, but more for the system. And I think there is something, I don't know, this is what I'm also exploring for my book, but I don't just disregard it. I see something there. I don't know yet how to point.
And I think, you know, the thing is to not only put it on the individual, because, you know, if I go back to my zoo and jungle analogy, if you grew up in the zoo and you've never had to take different perspectives, you know, there was nothing in your environment that almost catalyzed the need to get out of the socialized mind, or the, then it makes sense that that is where you are. I think so. What is the role of the systems we're in? What is the role of the society that we grew up in?
Yeah.
So, I don't think it's necessarily all on the individual, and something that I've been very curious about is if you look at the complexity that the world is in now,
Yeah.
and what is that potentially doing to the collective? Are more of us
Yeah.
almost forced now to explore, how do I take different perspectives? How do I get beyond ego? I don't know, but I do think that there is something there. I'm not an expert in it, but um,
But that's a good
I,
point. Like if we live in a capitalist world where companies need to make sure that the stakeholders get their share and that, then that overall system that we're in is going to shape individuals, is going to shape experiences. And yeah, I think that's a very good point in the sense that the bigger systems influence the subsystems and so on. And therefore they influence our behaviors and our approaches. Let's talk, maybe we have a couple of minutes for a couple of the questions. And I wanted to talk to you about wicked problems and specifically the problems in wicked. So could you maybe talk about or maybe describe what wicked problems are, and then the way that we look at wicked problems or the problems itself in complexity?
So I don't like the description wicked problem.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why. One reason is I wrote a post several, not too long ago, actually, where I said why we suck at solving wicked problems. And then I said the clue is in the words we use.
Yeah.
Because if you see, so my definition almost of a wicked problem would be something that is entangled, something that exists across boundaries, across disciplines. And I think it's better to see something like that as a pattern than as a problem. Because the moment I see, so if you take something like climate change or systemic poverty, if I see it as a problem to solve, I'm almost immediately stuck because it is just such a entangled, messy thing. Where do you even start? If I see it as a pattern with multiple interacting elements, then I have multiple potential entry points. And I'm not necessarily trying to solve it. I'm trying to change the trajectory of evolution. I'm trying to shift it. So I think the word problem almost immediately puts us in problem solution, quite kind of a linear frame of mind. So I would rather, if you want to keep the word wicked, I would rather talk about wicked patterns than wicked problems. And a key for me is, I think if we want to respond to those things, we need to transcend our own categories. So which brings me back to this whole thing of thinking in terms of thingness and categories. And, if you just think of academia and how the natural sciences and the social sciences and the economic, we need to get over that, and we need to start working much more in trans and interdisciplinary ways. And so I think how I think about it are wicked patterns that we need to find more generative ways of interacting with, and not necessarily framing them as problems.
Yeah, and it's almost like it's like complexity patterns. Looking at, goes back to what we said about the frameworks. It's not about rigid frameworks. It's about those patterns, wicked patterns or complexity patterns to deal and to better understand complexity and maybe shape it into where we want to go. What are your thoughts on wicked leadership? Is the same as, or it's something that I've been working on. I'm just curious, or complexity leadership. Is there something that is I guess what my point is wicked just complexity, or is wicked the like high complexity environment? Because some people say there are different levels of complexity. So is there, I guess, difference between wicked and complexity? Is there a certain level to wickedness, or do you see a spectrum of complexity? Just curious from your perspective on that.
I think there probably is a spectrum of, I think dealing with the complexity in a family versus dealing with a complexity in a school or in a company versus dealing with a complexity in a country versus dealing with something like climate change. They're different.
Levels, yeah.
I personally don't like the word wicked because I think it triggers it almost immediately triggers anxiety in me. So now I'm dealing with something wicked, like what? So, and I think part of the problem that we have is that people, and this is why I'm passionate about what I'm calling democratizing complexity, because we already know how to deal with it on different levels. And we are in it. You can't opt out of it. And there's beauty in it, So if we can almost let go of our anxiety around it and almost, I guess, befriend uncertainty again, we can engage with complexity in more generative ways. There's my friend Casper saw a billboard a few years ago. We said, "You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic." And so we tend to think about complexity as something that's inflicted on us, but we are part of it. And so I think labeling it as wicked, I'm not sure that serves us, because if I have to choose between solving a normal problem and then having to deal with something wicked, I think I would rather just leave the wicked alone and say, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not
sure. It goes back to that uncertainty, like you said. It's as humans, we're I guess designed to preserve, and anytime like wicked feels maybe threatening, and like our go-to mode is like avoid it rather than embrace it. And I think your message is like, we are part of complexity. We need to embrace it. We're in the system, not looking outside in on a system. So embrace it rather than avoid it. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying.
And I think seeing the beauty in it. So one of the things that if everything was certain, we could never have adventures. I think there's a quote, now for the life of me, I can't remember who said it, but it says, we've outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants. And I think it's time for us to rebuild that relationship. And these problems, or these patterns, they are anxiety producing. When I look, I come from the natural sciences, I'm a meteorologist. So the climate crisis, I find extremely concerning. But if I label it now as wicked, I almost think of the Wicked Witch of the West. It's almost like I don't know how to engage with it. But if I can see it as entangled and messy and scary, but I have some agency in it. I am the traffic. I'm part of this. So something small that I can do could have ripple effects. I'm not sure. I get where the wicked problem label comes from. I'm just not sure that in our current context, it serves us.
It's giving me some food for thought for my title. I'll have to. It's probably like the fifth title that I'm on, but it's I see your point, and I'm gonna think about it too. So I gotta.
I'm sorry.
No, it's a very good point, and that's something that I've been kind of exploring, because it's also catchy in a sense. What's what are wicked for a lot of people? They're not familiar with wicked problems, and so that's something that it's one of those things that you're feeling the system and understanding. So thank you. What would you like to leave us with, a message or something that you would like to share here?
I think probably the most important message is you are not the victim of complexity. You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. Because very often when people find themselves in deep complexity, they feel like they have no agency. And in companies, for example, people would say, oh, this is a really big ship to turn. But what turns a big ship is a small rudder, you know, and so I think to understand that we have agency, we are in these systems, we can navigate complexity. We do it all the time. If you have teenagers, you know how to navigate complexity. We just need to change the way that we think about these things, and we need to get out of the zoo in the mind and understand that we're in a jungle, and we know how to be there as humans. So I guess demystify the complexity, get fit for it, and see it as see the beauty in it.